"Sign the papers," the sheriff said, "tonight, or I can't promise what happens to them." Dakota Reeves stood on her own porch at midnight, hands open at her sides, watching a man in a heavy coat hold two people she loved at the end of a rope. An old man, 74 years old, wrists bound in the snow. A young woman beside him, shaking, held by a stranger paid to do exactly this. 3 nights ago, she had opened her door to 56 freezing bikers. She had asked no questions. She had simply let them in. Now a corrupt sheriff wanted her land, and he had decided hostages were the fastest way to get it. What he did not know was what she used to be before this diner, what she used to do, and what was already riding through the dark toward Hawk Ridge, 1,500 strong. The wind hit Hawk Ridge like a fist that night. Nobody saw it coming, not really. The Weather Service called for snow. They did not call for this. Dakota Reeves heard it first in the windows. A low groan, then a rattle, then a sound like the whole sky had cracked open. She stood behind the counter of her diner, wiping down a spot she had already wiped 3 times. She was 33 years old. She had a face that made people trust her before she said a word. Steady eyes. A jaw that did not move much when she talked. Some folks in town said she looked like she was always listening for something. They were right about that. A small photograph sat tucked behind the register, angled so only she could see it clearly from the grill. A little girl with dark curls, gap-toothed, caught mid-laugh at something outside the frame. Her daughter lived 2 states south with Dakota's own mother, safe in one school and one house, while Dakota worked the long hours a new business demanded. She called every night at 7, without fail. From the outside, it might have looked like sacrifice. From where Dakota stood, it was just patience, the kind that would pay off once the diner finally stood steady on its own 2 feet. 5 years ago, she wore a different uniform. 5 years ago, her hands did different work. Nobody in Hawk Ridge knew the full truth of it. She liked it that way. Tonight, the diner was empty. Just her, a pot of coffee going cold, and the radio playing low behind the register. The weatherman's voice cut in and out through static. "Repeat, this is now a level 3 storm warning. Winds gusting past 60 miles an hour. Temperatures will drop below 0 within the hour. Residents are advised to stay off Route 9 and shelter in place immediately." Dakota looked at the clock. 9:40 at night. She looked at the door. Then she heard the engines. At first it sounded like distant thunder, low and rolling. Then it grew closer, and she understood. Motorcycles. A lot of them. Coming down Route 9 straight into the worst of it. She stepped outside into air so cold, it burned her lungs. Snow came sideways, driven by wind that did not let up for even a second. She squinted down the road and saw headlights. Dozens of them, moving slow, too slow. They were not going to make it to the pass before the storm sealed it shut. She grabbed her coat off the hook by the door and walked out into the lot. The first bike rolled in tires, slipping on packed ice. The rider could barely hold the handlebars straight. His hands were shaking too hard to manage much else. Behind him came another, then another. Then a whole line of them engines, sputtering headlights, cutting weak yellow cones through the white. Dakota counted without meaning to. It was an old habit, one she had never quite shaken. 56. 56 riders pulling into her lot, looking for anything that resembled shelter. The lead rider killed his engine and swung off his bike. He was a big man, maybe late 50s, gray beard crusted white with ice. He held his hands out like he was trying to warm them on nothing at all. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough from the cold. "We got caught out on the pass. Bridge is out up ahead. Can't go forward, can't go back the way we came. Not in this." Dakota looked past him at the line of riders behind. Some of them could barely stand upright. One man knelt in the snow, another rider holding him up by the collar of his jacket. She did not think long. She never did when it mattered. "Get everybody inside," she said. "Now, leave the bikes. They'll keep." The big man blinked at her like he expected an argument, not an order. "Ma'am, there's 56 of us." "I heard you the first time," Dakota said. "Move." Something in her voice made him nod and turn without another word. He started waving the others in, shouting over the wind. Riders peeled off their bikes in 2s and 3s, stumbling toward the diner's lit windows, like moths finding the only flame left in the world. Dakota went back inside and started pulling chairs off every table. She flipped the sign from open to closed, then unlocked the storage room where she kept extra blankets for exactly this kind of night, though she never expected to need 56 of them at once. The first riders came through the door in a wave of cold air and wet leather. Some shook too hard to speak. She smelled gasoline-wet wool, and underneath it something quieter, something like fear that had been held down for a long time and only now allowed to surface. "Sit anywhere," she called out. "Boots off if they're wet. Coffee's on, more coming." A woman near the door, maybe 25, had lips gone pale blue at the edges. Dakota crossed the room fast and took her arm. "Look at me," she said. "Can you feel your fingers?" The woman shook her head. Her eyes had gone glassy. "Okay, you're with me." Dakota guided her to a booth near the heater vent and peeled off her wet gloves, checking for the white, waxy look that meant real trouble. Not there yet. Close, though. "Somebody bring me warm water," Dakota called. "Not hot, warm, and more blankets, second door on the left." The big biker who had spoken first watched her work, a look on his face that was hard to read. Not suspicion exactly. More like recognition, the kind that comes slow and does not want to be believed yet. His name was Garrett Boone. Everybody on the road called him Preacher on account of the sermons he used to give around the fire, back when the club still ran long rides across 3 states. He had not given one of those sermons in years, not since his own hands had stopped being steady enough for the work he used to do. He watched Dakota check circulation in a stranger's fingers, watched her ask the right questions in the right order, watched her move through a room of frightened, freezing people like she had done triage 100 times before. He had done triage 100 times before, too. Different circumstances, same rhythm. "Ma'am," he said again, quieter now. "Don't mean to pry, but you move like somebody who's done this before." Dakota did not look up from the woman's hands. Everybody in a small town knows first aid, mister. Comes with the territory. "Sure," Preacher said. He let it go, for now. By 10:30, the diner was full to the walls, 56 riders packed into a space built for maybe 40 customers on a good Saturday. Some sat on the floor with their backs against the counter. Some stood near the kitchen door where the heat came strongest. Nobody complained about the crowding. Cold does that. It makes people grateful for company instead of annoyed by it. Dakota moved through the room with a pot of coffee in one hand and a stack of mugs in the other, checking faces as she went looking for the ones that had gone too pale, the ones whose shivering had stopped. A body that quit shivering has quit fighting. She found one man slumped against the wall near the door, eyes half closed, breathing shallow. "Hey," she said, crouching down. "Hey, look at me." His eyes opened slow, unfocused. "What's your name?" "Dale," he managed. "Dale Ferris." "Okay, Dale. You're doing good. I need you to stay awake for me. Can you do that?" He nodded barely. Dakota called across the room. "I need 2 people to help get him closer to the heat. Somebody find dry clothes in his saddlebag, if he's got any." 2 riders moved fast, lifting Dale between them, careful with his arms in a way that came from training that never quite leaves the body. Preacher watched that too from a booth in the corner, arms crossed, saying nothing. They got Dale wrapped in 3 blankets near the kitchen vent. Dakota checked his pulse at the wrist, counted under her breath, watched his chest rise and fall. "He'll come around," she said mostly to herself. "Just needs the warmth to catch up to him." An hour passed. Then 2. The wind outside did not let up. If anything, it got louder, throwing snow against the windows in long hissing sheets. The power flickered once, twice, then held. Dakota said a quiet thank you to whatever kept the lines up, because a diner full of freezing strangers with no lights would have been a very different kind of problem. She kept the coffee coming. She kept checking hands and faces. She did not sit down once. Somewhere in the back of her mind, under all of it, she registered that she had missed her 7 o'clock call again. The storm had likely knocked the phone lines down hours ago. Her mother would understand. Her daughter maybe a little less so, but there would be time to make it up to her once the roads cleared and the world went back to being ordinary. Around midnight, an old man walked through the door. He came in slow, stomping snow off his boots, a wool cap pulled low over silver hair. He looked to be past 70, but he moved like a man who had spent a life doing hard work and had not entirely given it up yet. "Earl," Dakota said, surprised. "What in the world are you doing out in this?" "Saw the lights on," Earl Whitfield said. "Figured you might need an extra pair of hands. Looks like I figured right." He looked around the crowded diner at 56 strangers in leather and denim, with ice still melting off their jackets, and he did not flinch. He hung his coat by the door like he owned the place and rolled up his sleeves. "You got extra blankets somewhere, Dakota?" "Back room, might be running low." "I'll check my truck. Got 2 old quilts back there I keep for emergencies." He was already heading back out into the storm before she could argue with him. Preacher watched the old man go, then looked at Dakota. "Friend of yours?" "Nearest thing I've got to family out here," Dakota said. "Earl's lived on the ridge longer than I've been alive. Fixed half the trucks in this county at one point or another. He's not scared of us." "Earl's not scared of much," Dakota said. "He judges people by what they do, not what they ride." Preacher considered that a moment like it was the kind of answer he had been hoping to hear, but was not sure this town would give him, because the town, up until tonight, had given him something else entirely. 3 hours earlier, before the worst of the storm hit, the club had rolled through the center of Hawk Ridge looking for gas and a hot meal. What they got instead was a line of locked doors and one gas station attendant, who told them flat out that Hawk Ridge did not want their kind stopping long. They got that message loudest from a man in a sheriff's jacket. Sheriff Roy Vance had pulled his cruiser across the 2-lane road just past the town limit sign, lights flashing red and blue against the falling snow. He stepped out, slow thumbs hooked in his belt, and looked over the line of motorcycles like he was counting up a debt somebody owed him. "This road's closed to through traffic," he said, though it was not. "Storm's coming in hard, Sheriff," Preacher had said, keeping his voice even. "We're not looking for trouble. Just need somewhere to wait it out." "Not in my town, you don't." Vance had looked past him at the line of bikes, at the patches on their jackets, at 56 faces he had already decided he did not like. "Groups like yours cause problems wherever you stop. Vandalism, fights, scaring off decent folks. I've seen it plenty." "We haven't caused you a single problem tonight," Preacher said. "And you won't, because you're not stopping here." Vance rested a hand on his hip, close enough to his sidearm to make the point without saying it out loud. "Keep moving. There's a rest stop 40 miles east. Not my jurisdiction out there." 40 miles in a storm, already swallowing the road whole. It might as well have been another planet. They tried the rest stop anyway, tried to push through until the pass gave out beneath them, and the bridge ahead came up on the radio as impassable. That was when they turned back half frozen, looking for anything with a light still on. They found Dakota's diner, because it was the only building left on Route 9 that had not gone dark for the night. She did not know any of that yet. Not the part about Vance, not the part about the closed doors in town. All she knew was that 56 strangers had needed help, and she had given it the way she figured any decent person would. She would learn the rest soon enough. Around 1 in the morning, headlights swept across the diner's front windows. A cruiser pulled into the lot, engine idling red and blue lights, cutting slow circles through the snow. Dakota looked up from the coffee pot. Through the window, she saw Sheriff Vance step out of his car, adjusting his hat against the wind, and start walking toward the door, like a man arriving somewhere he had already decided he was in charge of. The bell over the door rang. Cold air rushed in behind him. Every head in the diner turned. 56 faces, tired and half-thawed, all looking at the man in the uniform. The room full of low talk and clinking mugs a moment ago went quiet in a way that felt heavier than the storm outside. Vance stopped just inside the door and looked around slowly, taking in the crowd like he was cataloging evidence. "Well," he said, "this is quite a gathering." "Evening, Sheriff," Dakota said, setting the coffee pot down. "Storm caught these folks out on the pass. Bridge is out. I gave them somewhere warm to wait it through. Did you now? Vance's eyes moved over the room again, lingering on patches, on jackets, on faces that had learned a long time ago not to look too eager under a badge's gaze. You know who these people are, Ms. Reeves? I know they were freezing to death on the side of the road an hour ago, Dakota said. That's all I needed to know. They're trouble. Whole clubs like this roll through, take what they want, leave a mess for the rest of us to clean up. Nobody's taken anything, Dakota said. Nobody's made a mess. They've been sitting in booths, drinking coffee and thanking me for the blankets. Vance's jaw tightened. He did not like being contradicted, especially not in front of a room this size. This isn't a shelter, Ms. Reeves. It's a private business. You've got no obligation to house 50-some-odd strangers overnight. No, Dakota agreed. I don't have an obligation. I have a choice. And I already made it. A ripple went through the room, quiet but present. A few riders exchanged glances. Preacher, still in his corner booth, watched the exchange without moving arms, folded eyes steady on the sheriff's face. Vance stepped closer to the counter, lowering his voice like that. Made it more private, though everyone could still hear every word. You want my advice? You'll get them moving out at first light, storm or no storm. This town's got a reputation to keep, and groups like this don't help it. They'll leave when the roads are safe to travel, Dakota said. Not a minute before storm or your reputation notwithstanding. For a moment, Vance just looked at her. Something behind his eyes was not quite anger and not quite calculation, but sat somewhere close to both. Then he straightened his hat and turned toward the door. We'll talk again once the weather clears, he said. Count on it. The bell rang again as he left the cruiser's lights sweeping once more across the windows before pulling out onto the empty road. The room exhaled all at once like it had been holding its breath the whole time Vance stood inside. Preacher finally moved, unfolding his arms and leaning forward on the table. You didn't have to do that. Do what? Stand up to him like that. In front of all of us. Most folks around here would have used him as an excuse to run us out into the storm. Dakota picked the coffee pot back up, refilling mugs as she went steady as ever. I don't run people out of my diner for the way they look. Never have. Not planning to start tonight. A lot of towns feel different, Preacher said quietly. We've had doors slammed on us plenty of times. Gas stations that suddenly ran out of gas the second we pulled up. Diners that got real busy right when we walked in. Then those towns got it wrong, Dakota said. You were cold. I had room. Rest of it's just noise. Earl Whitfield, sitting nearby with a mug of coffee warming his hands, chuckled low under his breath. That's about as close to a sermon as you'll get out of her, boys. She don't say much, but she means every word she does say. The few riders near him laughed quiet and tired, the kind of laugh that comes after a long stretch of fear finally starts to loosen its grip. Dale Ferris, the man. Dakota had pulled from near collapse earlier, sat up straighter in his blankets, and managed a small, crooked smile. Feeling more like myself, he said. Thanks to you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet, Dakota said. Storm's not done with us. As if the sky itself had been listening, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows hard enough to make a few riders flinch. The lights flickered, held, then flickered again. Preacher looked toward the window, toward the white nothing beyond it. How long's this supposed to last? Radio said 48 hours, give or take, Dakota said. Bridge is out on the pass. Could be 3 days minimum before anyone gets a crew out to fix it. Longer if the storm doesn't let up. 56 riders and one waitress snowed into a diner for the better part of 3 days. Nobody said it out loud, but the math of it settled over the room, slow and heavy, like the storm itself. We'll manage, Dakota said, mostly to break the silence. Got enough food in the back to hold us a good while. Generator if the power drops. We'll be all right. Appreciate that, Preacher said. More than you know. Dakota looked at him a moment, studying the way he sat, the way he held his shoulders. Even tired, the way his eyes moved across a room like he was always checking exits without meaning to. She recognized something in that. She did not say what. Instead, she turned to the counter and started portioning out what was left of the evening soup, stretching it as far as it would go. Hours passed that way. Slow, quiet, full of small kindnesses nobody made a show of. A writer named Rebecca Doyle, young, maybe 26, with tired eyes and a jacket 2 sizes too big for her, helped Dakota wash mugs in the back sink without being asked. Earl told old stories about fixing trucks in weather twice as bad as this, back before half the roads out here were even paved. A few riders dozed, sitting up, heads tipped back against booth cushions, finally warm enough to let their guard down. Around 3 in the morning, Dakota finally sat down. Just for a minute, she told herself, just to catch her breath. Preacher slid into the seat across from her, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. He set one in front of her without a word. "You've been on your feet since before we got here," he said. "Figured you could use this." "Thanks." She wrapped both hands around the mug, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers for the first time in hours. "Can I ask you something?" "You're going to anyway." A faint smile crossed his face. "Fair enough." He studied her a moment the way a man studies weather he is not sure he trusts yet. "Where'd you learn to do what you did tonight? The way you checked hands for frostbite? The way you gave orders and people just followed, no questions asked? That's not diner training." Dakota did not answer right away. She looked down at her coffee at the small ring of steam rising off the surface. "Long time ago," she said finally, "I did work that required it." "What kind of work?" "The kind you don't talk about in a diner at 3 in the morning. Preacher accepted the boundary without pushing past it. Something in his eyes had shifted through some old memory stirring, like he had seen this exact stillness in someone else a long time ago, somewhere far from Montana. He did not say what that memory was, not yet. The storm raged on outside, indifferent to all of it, burying the road, burying the bikes lined up in the lot, burying the whole town under a weight of snow it had not seen in decades. Inside the diner, 56 strangers and 2 locals sat together in the warm light, waiting it out, not knowing yet how much this one long night would come to matter, not knowing that a sheriff's grudge, an old debt between 2 families, and a woman's buried past were all about to collide right here in a diner that was never supposed to be anything more than a quiet stop on a quiet road. Dakota looked around the room once more before finally closing her eyes for a moment of rest. 56 people, 1 storm, and a decision she had made in less than 30 seconds that was about to change everything. She did not know it yet, but somewhere out there, past the snow and the dead radio signal, word of tonight was already starting to travel. Word that always finds its way, eventually, to the people who need to hear it most. The night was far from over. But the first test had already been passed. Dawn would bring no relief. It would bring questions. It would bring the sheriff back sharper this time, with paperwork instead of just words. It would bring the truth about why he wanted this land so badly, and why 56 bikers stranded on his doorstep had become for him not an inconvenience, but an opportunity. None of them knew that yet. For now there was only the coffee, the warmth, the storm outside, and a room full of people learning slowly that kindness had not run out of this world. Not entirely. Not here. Dakota closed her eyes for a moment, coffee still warm in her hands, and let herself rest just a little before the next long day began. Outside, the wind screamed on. Inside, for the first time in hours, it was quiet. Morning came slow and gray, the kind of light that barely counts as daylight at all. Dakota woke still sitting upright, and the booth neck stiff, coffee gone cold in front of her. Around her, the diner had settled into something close to peace. Riders slept in shifts, some curled on the floor under borrowed blankets. Some slumped together in booths, built for 4, but holding 6. She stood, joints protesting, and looked out the window. The world outside had turned white and featureless. Snow had piled halfway up the doors of the parked motorcycles, burying wheels, burying kickstands, burying the road itself, until it was just a suggestion of where a road used to be. No plows, no traffic, no sign the outside world remembered this stretch of Montana existed at all. She moved to the kitchen and started the morning routine out of habit more than anything. Eggs, bread, whatever bacon she had left in the walk-in. Feeding 56 people breakfast was not something she had planned for when she opened for business 3 years ago. But she found the work steadying. It gave her hands something to do while her mind sorted through everything the night had handed her. Earl shuffled in not long after rubbing sleep from his eyes, an old flannel jacket buttoned crooked over his shirt. "You get any rest at all?" he asked. "Some?" "Didn't look like it." He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, watching her crack eggs into a bowl with the same steady rhythm she did everything. "You know, Dakota, most folks would have called this a disaster. 56 strangers storm outside sheriff making noise. You just made breakfast." "Wasn't much choice in it," Dakota said. "People were cold. Now they're hungry. Feels simple enough to me." Earl chuckled low and warm. "That's the thing about you. You make hard things sound simple. Took me 60 years to learn that trick, and I'm still not half as good at it as you are. You give yourself too little credit, old man. And you give yourself too little credit for what you did last night, standing up to Roy Vance like that." Earl's voice dropped a shade, turned more serious. "That man doesn't forget being told no. Not in a room full of witnesses." Dakota paused, spatula hovering over the pan. "You know him well." "Known him since he was in diapers," Earl said. "Knew his daddy better. Good man Wendell Vance. Ran the hardware store here for 30 years before he passed. Roy's not a bad man, not down deep. But he's hungry for something his daddy never was. Recognition, maybe. Money, more likely. What's that got to do with 56 bikers stuck in my diner?" Earl was quiet a moment, looking out the frosted window like he was choosing his words carefully. "There's talk around town. Nothing official yet. About the county wanting to widen Route 9. Turn it into a proper 4-lane highway connected up to the interstate 2 counties over. Be a lot of money moving through here if that happens. A lot of land changing hands, too." Dakota's hands slowed on the pan. "My land sits right on that stretch." "Yours and a few others," Earl said. "But yours has got the best frontage. Flattest ground for building. If somebody wanted to make a case that this stretch of road wasn't safe, wasn't fit for a growing business, wasn't the kind of place decent families ought to stop, they'd want a reason," Dakota finished. "Something that looks bad in the county paper. Something a sheriff could point to and say, 'See, I told you this place was trouble.'" 56 bikers stranded here in a storm," Earl said quietly. "Might be exactly the kind of story a man like that could use, if he wanted to use it." Dakota did not say anything for a long moment. She thought about Vance's face the night before, the way his eyes had moved across the room, cataloging rather than assessing danger. Not fear. Calculation. "You think he's after my land," she said. "I think," Earl said carefully, "that a man who wants something bad enough will find a reason to justify taking it. And a diner full of outlaws snowed in overnight is about as good a reason as he's likely to get handed to him for free." The eggs finished cooking in silence after that. Dakota plated them out onto trays without her usual steady rhythm. Her mind working through angles the way it used to work through a different kind of problem a long time ago in places far from this kitchen, by the time the riders started waking. Stretching stiff limbs, murmuring thanks for the smell of breakfast, Dakota had pushed the worry down where it would not show on her face. That was another old habit. Some things you carry without letting anyone see the weight of them. Preacher was one of the first up, moving with the careful stiffness of a man whose knees had given him more trouble than he let on. He found a seat at the counter and watched Dakota work the griddle. "Smells like heaven in here," he said. "Don't get used to it," Dakota said, sliding a plate toward him. "This is emergency rations. Regular menu's a lot less generous." He laughed, quiet and genuine, the first real laugh she had heard from him since the storm hit. Fair trade for a warm floor and a roof that isn't caving in. Around them, the room slowly filled with the sound of a small community waking up together. Forks scraping plates. Low conversation. Someone had found an old radio in the corner and was fiddling with the dial trying to coax a working station out of the static. Rebecca Doyle came up to the counter with an empty coffee pot, offering to refill it for Dakota without being asked twice. She had a quiet way about her, watchful, like she was always half a step from flinching even when nothing threatening was happening around her. "You've done this before," Dakota said, nodding at the coffee pot in Rebecca's hands. "Waited tables a few years back," Rebecca said. "Before the club, before a lot of things." There was something underneath the way she said it, something guarded that Dakota noticed but did not push. Everybody carried something. She, of all people, understood that better than most. "Well, I appreciate the help," Dakota said instead. "Extra hands make the morning go faster." Rebecca gave a small smile and got to work moving table to table with the pot-filling mugs, exchanging quiet words with riders who thanked her by name. Dakota watched her a moment longer than she meant to, some old instinct flagging something she could not quite name yet. She let it go. For now. The morning wore on slow and steady. Outside, the storm had not weakened at all. If anything, the wind had picked up again, driving snow sideways past the windows in long white sheets that made it impossible to see past the parking lot. Around mid-morning, the radio in the corner finally caught a working signal crackling through a wall of static before settling into something clear enough to understand. "9. Residents are advised the Route 9 pass remains impassable following last night's avalanche near mile marker 42. County crews report the access bridge sustained significant structural damage and will require a minimum of 3 days for temporary repair, weather permitting. Residents in outlying areas should prepare for extended isolation." A murmur ran through the room. A murmur, 3 days, minimum. Weather permitting, which in a storm like this meant nothing certain at all. Preacher looked over at Dakota. 3 days is a long time to ask a stranger to house 56 people. "Wasn't asking," Dakota said. "Wasn't a choice either way, I see it. You're here till the road clears. That's just how it is." "Most folks would have called that a burden," Preacher said. "Most folks aren't me," Dakota said simply, and went back to clearing plates. By early afternoon, with the storm still howling and no end in sight, a kind of rhythm had settled over the diner. People found small jobs to do, whether Dakota asked for help or not. A few riders went out in shifts to check on the bikes, brushing snow off engines, making sure nothing critical had frozen solid. Others helped Earl haul in more firewood from the shed out back, since the generator alone would not be enough if the power failed for good. Dale Ferris, fully recovered from the frostbite scare of the night before, spent the afternoon fixing a wobbly table leg with nothing but a pocket knife and a scrap of wood he found in the storage room. Small kindness answered with small kindness. That was the pattern of the day. Earl pulled up a stool near the counter around noon and watched Dakota work through the lunch rush with the same tired, patient smile he always wore. He had lived long enough to know that trouble rarely announces itself all at once. It comes in pieces. A sheriff's visit here, a worried word there. A whole life's worth of small warnings if a person knows how to listen for them. "You know," Earl said, "I fixed trucks in this county for 43 years. Learned something in all that time worth passing on if you want to hear it. Always got time for you, Earl. An engine don't fail all at once," he said. "It fails a little bit every day, quiet until one morning it just won't turn over. Folks are the same way. Towns are the same way too. This one's been failing a little bit every day for longer than you'd think, and most people around here are too busy to notice." Dakota wiped down the counter, listening. "Roy Vance wasn't always like this," Earl went on. "I remember him as a boy, helping his daddy sweep out the hardware store on Saturdays. Polite kid. Wanted to make his daddy proud. Something happened to him along the way, turned that wanting into something meaner. I don't know exactly what, but I've watched it happen to enough men in my life to recognize the shape of it." "You think there's still something decent left in him?" "I think there's always something decent left in a man," Earl said. "Even when he's buried it deep enough that even he can't find it anymore. Doesn't mean you go easy on him. Just means you don't give up on the idea that it's there." Dakota thought about that for a long moment, the words settling somewhere quiet in her chest. That's a generous way to see the world, Earl. Only way I've found worth keeping, he said. Bitterness is heavy to carry. I got tired of hauling it around a long time ago. Across the room, Rebecca Doyle sat near the window, staring out at the unbroken white arms wrapped tight around herself, despite the warmth of the diner. Dakota noticed the way the younger woman's eyes kept drifting toward the door every time it rattled in the wind, the way her shoulders tensed at sounds that did not seem to bother anyone else. She filed it away. Everybody carried something. Some people carried it louder than others. Rebecca carried hers in silence, and silence like that Dakota had learned a long time ago usually meant the weight underneath was heavier than it looked. She would ask eventually. Not today. Today there was still a storm to survive, and a room full of people who needed her steady, more than they needed her curious. Around 3 in the afternoon, headlights swept across the parking lot again. Dakota looked up from behind the counter, already half expecting who it would be. Sure enough, the sheriff's cruiser rolled to a stop outside, engine idling in the blowing snow. The room went quiet the way it had the night before, conversation dying mid-sentence, as 56 pairs of eyes turned toward the door. Vance stepped out of his car and walked toward the diner with a folder tucked under one arm. Not just a badge and an opinion this time. Paperwork. The bell over the door rang as he stepped inside, stomping snow off his boots with more force than necessary. "Afternoon, Ms. Reeves," he said, voice carrying that same false politeness from the night before. "Mind if I have a word?" Dakota wiped her hands on a towel and came around the counter. "Say what you came to say, Sheriff." Vance glanced around the room once more, taking in the crowd of riders, some watching him with open wariness, some pretending not to watch at all. He set the folder down on the counter and flipped it open. "County's got some concerns," he said, "about properties along Route 9 that might not be meeting current commercial safety codes. Given the circumstances of last night, seemed prudent to start the paperwork on an inspection." "An inspection," Dakota repeated flatly. "In the middle of a storm that's got the whole county snowed in." "Storm doesn't stop paperwork," Vance said. "And a diner sheltering this many unregistered guests overnight raises questions about occupancy limits, fire code compliance, things of that nature." "Unregistered guests," Dakota said, "would be human beings who would have frozen to death on the side of the road if I hadn't let them in." "I understand the sentiment," Vance said in a tone that made clear he did not particularly. "But sentiment and code compliance are two different matters. I'd advise you to start thinking about how you plan to resolve this situation once the road's clear, for everyone's benefit." Preacher had come up beside Dakota without either of them noticing, arms crossed, eyes steady on the sheriff's face. "Sheriff," he said evenly, "with respect, seems like your concern is a little more focused on us than it is on fire codes." Vance's eyes flicked to Preacher, cool and unbothered. "You'll forgive me if a road full of stranded bikers doesn't exactly inspire confidence in a town like Hawk Ridge. We've had trouble before with groups passing through. I'm just doing my job, keeping this community safe." "We haven't caused a lick of trouble," Preacher said. "Not one complaint. Not one broken window. Just 56 cold people grateful for a warm floor." "For now," Vance said. He closed the folder and tucked it back under his arm. "I'll be back once the road's clear, Ms. Reeves. We'll finish this conversation then." He turned and walked back out into the storm without waiting for a reply, the bell over the door ringing sharp behind him. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after the cruiser pulled away, engine sound fading into the wind. "He's not here about fire codes," Preacher said finally, low enough that only Dakota could hear. "No," Dakota agreed. "He's not." She thought about what Earl had told her that morning. The highway, the land. The kind of story a man could build out of 56 stranded bikers if he wanted an excuse badly enough. She did not say any of that out loud. Not yet. Some things needed more proof before they were worth speaking into a room full of tired, worried people. Instead, she went back behind the counter and started the evening prep, falling into the same steady rhythm that had carried her through the night before. Whatever Vance was building toward it would have to wait for the storm to pass. For now, there was still a diner full of people who needed feeding and warmth, and a reason to believe the world had not entirely turned against them. Evening came early, the gray daylight fading into full dark well before 5. The wind had not lessened at all. If anything, the temperature had dropped further, the windows fogging thick with condensation from so many bodies packed into one warm room. Dakota served dinner in shifts, stretching the diner's supplies as far as they would go. Nobody complained about small portions. Nobody expected more than what they were given, and everybody seemed grateful for exactly that. After the meal, as the room settled into a quieter evening rhythm, Earl brought out an old deck of cards from his coat pocket and started a slow game at one of the corner tables, drawing in a handful of riders eager for anything to pass the time. Laughter, quiet and tired, began to fill the corners of the room where fear had sat the night before. Dakota found herself watching it all from behind the counter. Arms crossed, a small, unfamiliar warmth settling in her chest. She had spent so many years learning to survive alone, to keep her guard up, to never let a room full of strangers feel like anything close to family. Tonight, despite everything, it felt like something close to that anyway. She did not notice at first that her sleeve had ridden up while she reached for a stack of mugs on the high shelf behind the counter. Preacher did. He was seated at the counter finishing the last of his coffee when his eyes caught the small mark on the inside of her wrist just below where her sleeve had slipped. Faded blue-green ink half hidden beneath a thin scar that ran across it the way old tattoos sometimes get marked over by the body's own healing. But he had seen that particular design before. He had seen it up close once on the wrist of a man he had bled beside in a place he did not talk about anymore. A trident, 3 prongs rising from a shield, an anchor threaded through the center. His coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. Dakota noticed him staring and pulled her sleeve back down without thinking, an old reflex faster than conscious decision. "Something wrong?" she asked. Preacher set his mug down slow, his eyes still on her wrist, even though the mark was covered now. His voice, when it came, was quiet enough that only she could hear it over the low hum of the room. "That tattoo," he said, "on your wrist. I know what that is." Dakota went very still. "I don't know what you think you saw," she said carefully. "I've seen it before," Preacher said. "Once, a long time ago, on the arm of a man I owed my life to." He leaned in slightly, voice dropping lower still. "You're not just somebody who happens to know first aid, are you, Dakota?" For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Around them, the diner carried on, warm and unaware cards, shuffling, quiet laughter rising and falling, the storm still hammering outside the frosted windows. Dakota looked at him, steady, the way she looked at every hard truth she had ever had to face. "No," she said, finally quiet enough that it barely carried past the space between them. "I'm not." Outside, the wind pushed against the windows like it had something urgent left to say. Inside, for the first time since the storm began, Dakota Reeves felt the past she had buried so carefully finally start working its way back up to the surface. Whatever was coming next, she understood now it was not going to stay buried much longer. The diner had gone quiet after Preacher's words. Not the comfortable quiet of a room settling down for the night. A different kind. The kind that comes when a truth finally gets spoken out loud after being carried alone for too long. Dakota stood behind the counter, arms crossed, looking at a man she had known for less than 24 hours. A man who somehow already knew a piece of her. She had never told anyone in this town, not once in 3 years of running this diner. "How?" she said finally. "How do you know what that mark means?" Preacher set his coffee mug down slow. He glanced around the room at the riders still playing cards, still laughing, quiet and tired near the fire. Nobody else was listening. This conversation belonged only to the two of them. "Not here," he said. "Give me a minute. Let me show you something." He got up and walked to his gear still piled near the door where he had left it the night before, half frozen and forgotten in the rush to get everyone warm. He dug through a saddlebag until he found a small tin box dented at one corner. The kind of box a man keeps for exactly one purpose: to hold the things too important to lose. He brought it back to the counter and set it down in front of her. "Open it," he said. Dakota looked at him a long moment before she reached for the lid. Her hands, steady through everything the last day had thrown at her, were not quite steady now. Inside sat a folded photograph, edges soft with age, a dog tag, the metal dulled but still legible, and a small carved wooden bird, rough but careful work, the kind of thing a man makes with his hands when he has nothing else to give. She picked up the dog tag first. Her breath caught somewhere deep in her chest. The name stamped into the metal was Michael Reeves. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. 15 years ago, Preacher said, I was a combat medic. Different life than the one I live now. But some things a person carries, no matter how many years pass. He took a slow breath, like the memory still cost him something to reach for. We were pulling wounded out of a firefight. Bad one, worse than most. Your husband was part of the unit providing cover so we could get our people out. Dakota's hand tightened around the dog tag. There was an explosion, Preacher went on. Took out half our extraction route. Michael was closest to it. Got 2 of my medics clear before it went off. Paid for that with a shattered leg and burns down one side. I was the one who patched him up enough to get him on the last transport out. I never knew, Dakota said. He never told me your name. Wouldn't surprise me, Preacher said. Men like him don't talk much about the people who helped carry them home. Too busy carrying the weight of what happened to everyone else. He nodded toward the carved wooden bird still sitting in the tin box. He gave me that before they loaded him onto the helicopter. Said it was for luck. Said if I ever made it out of that line of work in one piece, I should find a quiet way to pass it along to someone who needed it more than I did. Dakota picked up the small carving, turning it slow in her fingers. A sparrow wings half spread, whittled from a scrap of wood with a pocket knife by a man bleeding out on a stretcher. He passed 2 years after that, she said quietly. Different mission, different country. I got the folded flag and a box of his things, and that was supposed to be the end of it. I looked for you afterward, Preacher said. Wanted to bring this to you properly. But the world's a big place, and the trail went cold before I ever found the right town. And now here you are, Dakota said. Snowed into my diner in the middle of the biggest storm this county's seen in 20 years. Funny how the world works sometimes, Preacher said. Stopped trying to explain it a long time ago. Just try to pay attention when it hands me something worth paying attention to. Dakota held the small wooden bird a long while, feeling the weight of 5 years finally settle into something that made a strange kind of sense. She had spent so long believing the worst parts of her old life would never connect back to the quiet one she had built here. Tonight, in the middle of a storm, neither of them had asked for 2 broken pieces, had found their way back together anyway. Thank you, she said, for carrying this so long, for finding a way to bring it home. Wasn't hard, Preacher said. Just took the right storm to push us both into the same room. Neither one said anything else for a while. Outside, the wind kept up its steady grind against the windows. But inside, for just a moment, the noise of it seemed to fade into something almost peaceful. Later, once the diner had quieted and most of the riders had settled into whatever corner of floor or booth they had claimed as their own, Dakota sat alone at a back table, the small wooden bird still resting in her palm. She thought about the years before Hawk Ridge. About training exercises that started before sunrise and did not end until well past dark. About the particular kind of silence that settles over a team right before a mission, when nobody speaks, because there is nothing left worth saying, only the work ahead. She thought about Michael, the way he used to hum some tuneless little melody while he cleaned his gear, a habit that used to annoy her before it became one of the things she missed most. She thought about the folded flag, the box of his belongings, the quiet apartment she could not bear to live in afterward. She had left the service not long after that. Not because she stopped believing in the work, but because grief had hollowed out a space inside her that the work alone could not fill anymore. She needed something slower, something that let her build instead of tear down, protect instead of pursue. Hawk Ridge had given her that. A diner, a quiet town, a chance to matter to people in small, steady ways instead of large, violent ones. A place close enough to her mother and her daughter that she could still make the drive when the season allowed, even if the last 3 days had proven exactly how unpredictable that drive could turn out to be. She had never expected any piece of her old life to follow her here. Yet here it sat in the shape of a small carved bird carried across 15 years and half a country by a stranger who had turned out to be anything but. Grief did not disappear just because a person built a new life on top of it. She understood that more clearly now than she had in years. It simply waited quiet and patient for the right moment to remind her it was still there. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, that reminder had not felt like a wound reopening. It had felt like something closer to healing, like a debt finally settled, a circle finally closed. She tucked the wooden bird into her coat pocket close to her chest and let herself just for a moment grieve and be grateful at the same time. The next morning brought no relief from the weather. If anything, the storm had settled into a grinding, permanent kind of cold, the sky the color of old iron snow still falling in slow, relentless waves. Dakota woke before dawn, as she always did, and found Earl already up sitting near the window, with a mug of black coffee watching the world outside disappear under another foot of snow. "Can't sleep much these days," he said before she could ask. "Old bones don't need as much rest as they used to. Or maybe they've just seen enough that lying still with your eyes closed starts to feel like a waste of good time." "You're up earlier than the sun most mornings, Earl." "Sun's smart enough to sleep in when the weather's like this," Earl said. "Wish I had that kind of sense." Dakota poured herself coffee and sat across from him, glancing out at the buried lot, the row of motorcycles now just soft white mounds beneath the falling snow. "You knew Wendell Vance," she said. "Roy's father?" "Best friend I ever had," Earl said, something warm and sad crossing his face at the memory. "Grew up 2 farms over from mine. We ran wild together as boys back before life got hard for both of us in ways neither of us talked about much afterward." "What happened between you two?" "Nothing happened between us," Earl said. "Wendell and I stayed close right up until the day he passed. It's Roy I worry over. Boy had a rough go of it after his daddy died. Took the hardware store debt harder than anyone realized. Started keeping company with folks looking to make quick money off the highway project, and somewhere along the way, he stopped being the boy I used to pull out of the creek when he got himself stuck as a kid." Dakota looked up. "You pulled him out of a creek?" Earl gave a small, tired laugh. "Boy was maybe 9 years old. Wandered too far out on thin ice chasing a stray dog. Ice gave way right under him. I was the only one close enough to hear him hollering. Pulled him out half frozen, wrapped him in my own coat, carried him home myself." He shook his head slow. Told his daddy it was nothing. Didn't want the boy embarrassed in front of his friends. But I think about that day sometimes, watching the man he's turned into now. Wonder if I did him a disservice, letting him grow up thinking he owed nobody nothing. "You think that's why he's like this," Dakota said. "Chasing money, chasing this land. I think a man who's never had to sit with his own debts starts believing the world owes him more than it does," Earl said. "Roy's spent his whole life being rescued one way or another, without ever having to feel the weight of being saved. Maybe if he'd had to carry that weight himself even once, he'd think twice before trying to take something that isn't his." Dakota sat with that a long while, watching the snow fall outside, thinking about debts owed and never repaid, about the strange threads tying a whole town together, whether anyone noticed or not. By mid-morning, the diner had settled back into its steady rhythm. Breakfast came and went. Riders took turns checking on the bikes buried in the lot, clearing snow off engines that had no hope of starting again until the storm broke for good. Dale Ferris organized a rotation for firewood duty. Rebecca Doyle helped with dishes again, quiet as ever, though Dakota noticed her hands shook slightly every time the wind rattled the windows too hard. Around noon, the sheriff's cruiser appeared again, headlights barely visible through the heavy snowfall. This time, Vance did not come alone. A second car pulled in behind his, a plain sedan with county plates, and a thin man in a gray coat stepped out carrying a briefcase instead of a folder. The room tensed the moment the bell rang over the door. "Ms. Reeves," Vance said, stepping inside and shaking snow off his hat. "This is Mr. Holloway, County Records Office. He's got some paperwork that needs your signature." Dakota did not move from behind the counter. What kind of paperwork requires two men and a briefcase in the middle of a stormed sheriff? Holloway stepped forward with a thin, practiced smile and set the briefcase on the counter, clicking it open to reveal a stack of documents. "Given the safety concerns raised during last night's inspection," he said, "the county's prepared to offer a fair buyout on this property. Given the road expansion plans moving forward next year, it would save you the hassle of dealing with future code violations, permit disputes, matters of that nature." "I haven't had a single code violation in 3 years of business," Dakota said. "Not yet," Vance said, voice smooth as ice. "But sheltering 56 unregistered guests overnight in a building rated for considerably less occupancy, that's the kind of thing that draws attention. County's just trying to help you avoid a bigger headache down the road." "Sounds less like help," Preacher said from his seat at the counter, "and more like a threat with better handwriting." Vance's eyes flicked to him, cold and unimpressed. "This doesn't concern you." "Seeing as your whole case rests on us being here," Preacher said evenly, "I'd say it concerns me plenty." Dakota held up a hand before the exchange could grow any sharper. "I'm not signing anything," she said, looking straight at Holloway. "Not today. Not under a threat dressed up as a courtesy visit." Holloway's smile thinned slightly. "The offer stands for 72 hours, Ms. Reeves. After that, the county reserves the right to pursue code enforcement through more formal channels. I'd hate to see that happen to a small business owner in your position." "I'd hate to see a lot of things," Dakota said. "Doesn't mean I'll roll over to avoid them." Vance stepped closer, lowering his voice, though the whole room could still hear every word. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. All you have to do is sign, take the money, and start fresh somewhere else. Nobody has to make this ugly." "Somebody already has," Dakota said. "Just wasn't me." For a long moment, Vance and Dakota simply stared at each other across the counter, neither willing to be the first to look away. Behind him, Earl sat quietly at his usual table, watching the sheriff with an expression that was not quite anger, but sat close enough to it. "Roy," Earl said finally, voice calm but carrying clear across the room, "your daddy built that hardware store with his own 2 hands, never once tried to take something from a neighbor to build it bigger. I wonder what he'd make of watching his boy do exactly that." Something flickered across Vance's face at the mention of his father. A crack quick and small, gone almost as fast as it appeared. "Leave my father out of this, Earl." "Wish I could," Earl said. "But seems to me you're the one who's forgotten what he taught you. Might do you some good to remember." Vance's jaw worked tight and unreadable before he turned back to Holloway. "We're done here for today. Ms. Reeves has 72 hours to reconsider." He turned and walked out without another word, Holloway trailing behind him, briefcase clicking shut against the wind as the door swung closed behind them. The room stayed silent for a long moment after the cruisers pulled away. Roy Vance did not go straight back to the station. He sat in his cruiser at the edge of the lot for a while, engine running, heater blasting against a cold that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Earl's words kept turning over in his mind no matter how hard he tried to push them aside. "Your daddy built that store with his own 2 hands. Never once tried to take something from a neighbor to build it bigger." He remembered his father's hands, thick and calloused, sorting nails into little wooden bins behind the counter of a store that never made anyone rich, but never once cheated a single customer either. He remembered the way his father used to say that a man's word was the only inventory that mattered in the end. Vance had told himself more times than he could count that this land deal was different. That it was Progress Jobs' growth for a town that had been dying slow for 20 years. That taking Dakota's diner through the county's legal channels was not the same as stealing. Not really just business moving the way business always moved, but sitting there in the cold engine idling, snow piling up against his windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. He could not quite make himself believe his own explanation the way he used to. Holloway in the passenger seat glanced over. "Something wrong, Sheriff?" "No," Vance said too quickly. "Nothing's wrong, just thinking." "The deadline's set," Holloway said. 72 hours. After that, the paperwork moves forward whether she signs or not. You know that." "I know how the paperwork works," Vance said, sharper than he meant to. "Don't need it explained to me twice." Holloway held up both hands, saying nothing more, and Vance pulled the cruiser back onto the buried road, driving slow through the storm, his father's voice still somewhere in the back of his mind, quiet but persistent, like a debt that refused to stay forgotten. Back inside the diner, Preacher finally spoke again. "He's serious." "He's desperate," Dakota said. "There's a difference. Desperate men make mistakes serious men wouldn't." "Desperate men also do things serious men wouldn't," Preacher said. "That worries me more." Earl said nothing, staring at the door long after it had closed his expression, carrying the weight of a friendship decades old, watching the son of that friendship walk further away from the man his father had raised him to be. The afternoon passed slow and heavy with worry, though nobody spoke much of it out loud. The storm outside showed no sign of breaking wind, still driving snow sideways past the windows. Temperatures dropping further with each passing hour. Dakota kept herself busy the way she always did, cooking, cleaning, checking on riders who had started to feel less like strangers and more like people she genuinely cared for. But underneath the routine, her mind kept circling back to the 72-hour deadline, to the land beneath her feet, to a sheriff growing more desperate by the day. Around dinner time, Rebecca Doyle approached her quietly near the kitchen, glancing over her shoulder like she wanted to make sure nobody else could hear. "Can I talk to you a minute?" Rebecca said. "In private?" Dakota nodded and led her into the small back office, closing the door behind them. "What's on your mind?" Rebecca hesitated, twisting her hands together. "I used to work for the county," she said finally. "Before the club. Filing clerk records office, nothing important sounding, but I saw things. Documents that weren't supposed to leave the building." Dakota felt something tighten in her chest. "What kind of documents?" "Land assessments," Rebecca said. "For this whole stretch of Route 9, dated almost a year before the highway expansion was ever announced publicly. Vance's name was on half of them, tied to a shell company that already had offers in on 3 of the properties along here." "Including mine?" Rebecca nodded. "I didn't understand what I was looking at back then. Just knew it felt wrong seeing files that weren't supposed to be shared moved around like that. I left the job not long after. Joined the club because it felt like the first place that ever made sense to me." She swallowed hard. "I never told anyone what I saw. Didn't think it mattered anymore. Until I heard him in there today, threatening you." "Do you still have any of it?" Dakota asked. "Any proof?" "Copies," Rebecca said quietly. "I made copies before I left in case I ever needed them. Never thought I would. They're back at the clubhouse 3 states over. Not exactly easy to reach with the roads like this." Dakota absorbed that slowly, the shape of Vance's scheme finally becoming clear. Not just a sheriff throwing his weight around out of small-town spite. A man who had been planning this for a year, waiting for the right excuse to force her hand. "Thank you for telling me," Dakota said. "That took courage." "I should have said something sooner," Rebecca said. "I was scared. Still am, honestly. Man like that, he's got the whole county believing whatever he tells them." "Fear's not something to be ashamed of," Dakota said. "It's what you do, despite it, that matters. And you just did something that matters a great deal." Rebecca gave a small, uncertain smile, the first real one Dakota had seen from her since the storm began. They stepped back out into the main room just as the wind outside seemed to howl louder than it had all day, rattling the windows hard enough to make several riders look up from their card game. Preacher caught Dakota's eye from across the room, some silent question passing between them. She gave the smallest shake of her head. Not now. Later. That night, once the diner had quieted, Dakota sat in the back office with a notepad and the old satellite radio she kept for emergencies, the same one that had gotten her through 2 previous winters without power. She was not interested in confronting Vance with rumor or half-memory. She wanted something solid. She reached out on a channel she had not used in over a year, a contact from her old unit, who now worked in a role that let him make quiet calls on public records when a favor was owed. She kept the message short, the way she had been trained to keep every message that mattered. Need a records check. Route 9 land assessments, Hawk Ridge, Montana. Filed roughly 1 year back. Name attached is Roy Vance. Any help appreciated? The reply would not come quick, not through a channel like this, not in a storm like this. But she felt steadier having sent it. Fear and suspicion made for poor evidence. She had learned long ago that the surest way to win a fight was to make certain of the ground beneath her feet before she ever took the first step. She thought of Earl's words from that morning about a man who had never learned to sit with his own debts. She thought of Rebecca's quiet courage finally spoken out loud after being carried alone for so long. Whatever came next, she intended to meet it with proof, not just conviction. She set the radio down, rubbed the tiredness from her eyes, and allowed herself a moment of stillness before heading back out to check on the room full of people who had, without any of them planning it, become her responsibility to protect. Rebecca lingered near the office door a moment before Dakota noticed her there. "You didn't have to stay up with me," Dakota said. "Couldn't sleep anyway," Rebecca admitted. "Kept thinking about those files. Wondering if I should have said something the day I first saw them instead of waiting until I was scared enough to have no choice." "Most people wait," Dakota said. "Doesn't make what you did tonight any less brave." "Feels like it should have come sooner." "Courage doesn't run on a schedule," Dakota said. "It shows up when a person's ready to carry what comes after it. Sounds like tonight you finally were." Rebecca considered that some of the tension easing from her shoulders for the first time since the sheriff's visit. "You sound like you've thought about that a lot. Courage and timing." "Had reason to once upon a time," Dakota said. "Different uniform, same lesson." Rebecca did not push further, seeming to understand that some doors only opened partway, and that partway was still more than most people ever offered her. She said goodnight and headed back toward the main room, leaving Dakota alone again with the quiet hum of the radio and the storm still working at the windows outside. Evening settled in heavy and dark, the storm no closer to breaking than it had been 3 days ago. Dinner passed quiet, the earlier tension from Vance's visit still hanging over the room like smoke that would not clear. Earl broke the silence partway through the meal, tapping his fork against his mug to get a bit of attention. "Figure a room full of people waiting out a storm together. Could use something to talk about besides sheriffs and paperwork," he said. "Mind if an old man asks a question?" A few tired laughs answered him, and someone called out for him to go ahead. "What is it?" Earl asked, looking around the crowded room. "That kept you all riding all these years, not the bikes themselves. The reason underneath it." The room went quiet a moment, thoughtful rather than uncomfortable. Dale Ferris spoke up first. "My daddy rode before me. Taught me that a man's word matters more than his money. Out on the road, you learn quick who keeps their word and who doesn't. Doesn't take long to sort the two apart." "Community," said another rider, an older man named Otis, who had barely spoken since the storm began. "Most of us didn't have much family growing up, not the kind that stuck around. Found it out here instead. Found people who'd stop on the highway at 2 a.m. to help a stranger change a tire, no questions asked." Preacher agreed with a quiet nod. "Discipline," he added. "Riding teaches you discipline real quick, or it teaches you a hard lesson some other way. Respect for the road. Respect for the folks beside you. Same lessons my daddy tried to teach me on his own farm, just wearing different clothes. Rebecca stayed quiet through most of it, eyes down on her plate, until Earl gently turned his attention her way. "What about you, young lady? What brought you out here?" She hesitated a long moment before answering. "I grew up watching my mother work 3 jobs just to keep our lights on," she said finally. "Nobody ever showed up to help her. Not family, not neighbors, nobody. I promised myself if I ever found people who actually looked out for each other, I'd hold on to that with both hands and never let go." She glanced up, meeting a few understanding nods around the room. "This club, whatever else people think about us, they showed up. Every time. That's more than I can say for most of the world I grew up in." Dakota listened to all of it from behind the counter, feeling something shift quietly in her chest. She had spent 3 years assuming a certain kind of person rode with clubs like this, had built her own quiet assumptions, the way most of Hawk Ridge had, even while treating every one of them with basic decency. Tonight, listening to them speak plainly about discipline and community, and the debts owed to people who actually showed up, she recognized values she had carried through her own service, the same ones she tried to pass along in smaller ways now, one warm meal and one open door at a time. "My husband used to say something similar," she said, surprising even herself by speaking up. "Said a uniform doesn't make a man decent. Showing up when it's hard does. Guess that holds true whether the uniform's a badge, a flight suit, or a leather cut." A few quiet nods answered her around the room. The kind of understanding that did not need many words to pass between people who had all learned the same hard lessons in different corners of the same country. The meal wound down slow after that. Dishes cleared the room, settling into the comfortable murmur of a group that had stopped being strangers to each other days ago, even if the calendar insisted it had only been 3. That night, once the diner had quieted, Dakota lingered a while longer in the small back office with Rebecca's revelation still sitting heavy in her mind. She was not interested in confronting Vance with rumor alone. She wanted proof solid enough that nobody could argue with it. Later proof that would hold up long after this storm had passed and the roads had gone back to ordinary. She reminded herself, as she had 100 times before in a different kind of work entirely, that fear and suspicion made for poor evidence. The surest way to win any fight was to make certain of the ground beneath her feet before she took the first real step forward. Dakota excused herself after the meal to check the woodshed out back, needing more fuel to keep the generator running through what promised to be another brutal night. She pulled her coat tight and stepped out into the biting cold snow, crunching hard beneath her boots. She smelled the smoke before she saw the flames. The woodshed tucked 20 feet behind the diner had caught fire-orange light already licking up through cracks in the old wooden siding, smoke pouring thick into the night sky. "Fire!" Dakota shouted, already sprinting toward the diner's back door. "Fire in the woodshed! Everybody out now." The door burst open behind her, riders pouring out into the cold preacher at the front of them, taking one look at the growing flames before barking orders in a voice that carried the same steady command Dakota's had the night of the storm. "Snow buckets now. Anybody near the kitchen, grab what you can. Form a line to the shed." 56 people who had been strangers 3 days ago moved like a single unit, packing snow into buckets, forming a chain from the kitchen door to the burning shed, working fast and steady, despite the biting cold and the panic threatening to take hold. Dakota worked at the front of the line closest to the flames, directing the effort with the same calm authority that had gotten 56 frozen strangers safely inside 2 nights before. "Keep the line moving. Don't stop for anything." Dale Ferris worked near the middle of the bucket line the whole time, passing snow hand to hand without a single complaint, his breath coming out in short white clouds against the dark. Beside him, a younger rider named Cole kept glancing nervously toward the tree line, like he expected something worse to come out of the dark at any moment. "Easy," Dale told him, voice steady despite the cold biting at both of them. "Fire's near out. Just keep the line moving." "Feels wrong," Cole muttered. "Fire like that out here, middle of a blizzard." "Lot of things have felt wrong since we rolled into this town," Dale said. "Don't mean we stopped doing what needs doing. It took almost 20 minutes, but between the packed snow and the diner's small fire extinguisher, they finally beat the flames down to smoking embers. The shed itself scorched and ruined, but the fire contained before it could spread to anything else. By the time the last embers hissed out under a final layer of packed snow, the group stood in a loose circle around the ruined shed, breath fogging thick in the freezing air, exhaustion plain on every face. Dakota stood in the aftermath, breathing hard, soot streaked across her face, looking at the wreckage of the shed that had held most of their backup firewood. "How does a woodshed catch fire in the middle of a blizzard?" she said more to herself than anyone else. Earl, standing nearby wrapped in a heavy coat, looked at the scorch pattern along the shed's outer wall with a careful, practiced eye. "Wood doesn't catch like that on its own, not out here in weather like this," he said quietly. "That burn pattern started from the outside in. Somebody set that fire, Dakota, on purpose." The words settled over the group like a fresh kind of cold, colder, even than the storm still howling around them. Preacher stepped up beside Dakota, jaw-tight eyes scanning the tree line beyond the shed like he expected to find someone still watching from the darkness. "You think it was Vance?" he said. "I think," Dakota said slowly, "that a man given a 72-hour deadline might not be willing to wait that long if he thinks a little chaos could speed things up." She looked back toward the diner, toward the warm windows still glowing against the dark, toward the 56 people who had trusted her enough to stay, and felt something harden inside her that had nothing to do with the cold. "He wants us scared," she said. "Wants us panicked enough to leave on our own, save him the trouble of forcing us out properly." "Doesn't seem like it's working," Preacher said, nodding at the group still gathered nearby, tired but steady. Nobody running for their bikes despite the fire, despite the threat, despite everything Vance had thrown at them so far. "No," Dakota agreed, a grim kind of resolve settling into her voice. "It doesn't." Preacher organized a quiet perimeter check before anyone went back inside, splitting the group into small pairs to walk the tree line behind the diner and check for any sign of who might have set the blaze. Dakota joined Dale near the far edge of the property, flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the falling snow. They found the tracks about 30 yards out. Boot prints, half filled already with fresh snow, leading away from the shed toward a spot where a vehicle had clearly idled long enough to leave a slush-filled depression in the road shoulder. "Somebody parked out here a while?" Dale said, crouching to study the tire marks. "Watched the place probably. Waited for a good moment." "Or knew exactly when everyone would be busy with dinner," Dakota said, following the tracks with her flashlight until they faded into the deeper snow beyond the tree line. "Think it was Vance himself?" Dale asked, "or somebody he sent?" "Doesn't much matter which," Dakota said. "Either way, it tells us how far he's willing to go." She straightened flashlight beam sweeping once more across the empty road before she clicked it off. "Let's photograph what we can before it's buried for good and get back inside. Cold's not going to wait for us to finish thinking it over." Wasitis. They spent the next hour checking the shed's remains, salvaging what firewood they could, making sure no embers still smoldered dangerous beneath the snow. Rebecca worked quietly beside Dakota through it all, saying little though the fear in her eyes had shifted into something closer to determination. Once the worst of the cleanup was done, Preacher pulled Dakota aside near the diner's back door, his voice low and steady. "There's something you should know about how this club operates," he said. "Might matter given where things are heading." "I'm listening." "Every chapter, every club on the road, we've got a code among us," Preacher said. "Call it old-fashioned, call it whatever you want. But if one of our own is ever in real trouble, truly in danger, there's a signal that goes out. Word travels rider to rider, chapter to chapter, faster than most folks would believe possible. We call it a Mayday call. Haven't had to use one in years. Hope we don't have to use one now." "What happens when that call goes out?" Dakota asked. "Depends how bad things get," Preacher said. "But I'll tell you this much. Nobody who's ever heard that call has ignored it. Not once, not in 30 years I've been riding." He looked out at the dark tree line beyond the ruined shed. "Vance doesn't understand what he's poking at here. Man like that sees 56 of us and thinks he's found an easy target. Doesn't understand that 56 is just the number that happened to get stuck in this particular storm. Dakota studied him a long moment, something steady settling behind her eyes. You think it might come to that? The call. I think, Preacher said carefully, that a man willing to burn a shed to scare a room full of frozen strangers isn't a man who's going to stop on his own. I'd rather have that call ready and never need it than need it and not have it ready. Dakota nodded slowly, filing the words away, understanding for the first time just how deep the loyalty ran among the people she had sheltered without a second thought 3 nights ago. Thank you, she said, for telling me. Seemed only fair, Preacher said. You gave us shelter without asking a single question. Least I can do is make sure you understand exactly who you're sheltering. Later that night, once the group had settled back inside, exhausted but safe, Earl found Dakota alone near the counter, staring out at the dark, where the shed still smoked faintly against the snow. You did good tonight, he said. Kept everyone calm. Kept the fire from spreading. That's not luck, Dakota. That's training. Training doesn't undo a threat like this, Dakota said. Vance isn't going to stop with a burned shed. No, Earl agreed. He's not. But you're not facing him alone anymore. You've got 56 people in this room who'd stand beside you now, and one old man who's not going anywhere either. Dakota looked at him, something tired but grateful passing across her face. Why do you care so much, Earl, about all of this? About me? Because somebody showed me kindness once, a long time ago, when I didn't deserve it and couldn't repay it, Earl said. Man doesn't forget a debt like that. Spends the rest of his life looking for ways to pass it forward instead. What kindness was that? Dakota asked. You've never told me. Earl was quiet a moment, looking down at his hands, weathered and thick-veined from decades of honest work. Came home from a hard stretch of my own with more troubles in my head than I knew how to carry, he said finally. Wasn't a good husband those first few years. Wasn't a good neighbor either, truth told. There was a woman ran the general store back then named Louise. Never once turned me away when I couldn't pay for what I needed. Never once judged me for the state I showed up in some mornings. Just fed me, listened when I needed listening to, and waited patient for the man underneath the trouble to come back around. Did he? Dakota asked quietly. Come back around. Took some years, Earl said, a faint smile crossing his face. But yes, he did. And every kindness I've handed out since then I've handed out because Louise never once asked me to earn it first. Just gave it plain and simple and trusted the rest would sort itself out eventually. Dakota nodded slowly, understanding settling deep and warm in her chest despite the cold night around them. That's what you saw in me that first night. Doing the same for these riders. That's exactly what I saw, Earl said. And I'll tell you something else. The world's got a shortage of Louises in it these days. Man like Vance, chasing money and reputation, he'll never understand what a single, unearned kindness can do for a person who's forgotten what it feels like to be trusted. But you understand it. Always have, long as I've known you. They sat together a while longer, in comfortable silence, the storm still pressing against the windows, the ruined shed a dark scar against the white. Get some rest, Earl said eventually, rising slow from his seat. Tomorrow's bound to bring its own troubles. No sense meeting them already worn out. You first, old man, Dakota said, a faint, tired smile finally breaking through. You're no spring chicken yourself. Earl chuckled low and warm and made his way toward the back room where a cot had been set aside for him days ago. Dakota watched him go, then turned back toward the dark window, toward the scorched shed, toward whatever tomorrow was bound to bring. Preacher had said as much himself, quiet and certain, standing beside the ruined shed earlier that night. 56 was just the number that happened to get stuck in this particular storm. The brotherhood behind that number ran far wider than any single storm could measure, wider than Vance or Halloway, or the county records office could ever hope to account for on paper. Dakota did not yet know how far that word might spread if it ever needed to. She only knew, standing at her window that night, watching snow bury the last visible edge of the road, that she was no longer facing this fight the way she had faced so much of her life before. Alone, quiet, carrying the weight without complaint. Tonight, for the first time in 5 long years, she understood what it meant to have people standing at her back who had chosen to be there, not out of obligation, but out of the same steady decency she had shown them the very first night the storm rolled in. The storm was not finished with them. Neither was Roy Vance. But neither Dakota knew now where they finished fighting back. Whatever the next 3 days demanded of her, she would not be facing it the way she had faced so much else, since Michael died quietly alone, convinced that asking for help was a weakness she could not afford. She had a diner full of proof now that the opposite was true. 56 strangers, 1 old man, and a young woman finally brave enough to speak, had already shown her that much long before the sun came up on whatever tomorrow intended to bring. The 72 hours ran out just after midnight. Dakota knew it the moment she saw the clock behind the counter tick past 12. She had been watching that clock for 3 straight days, the way a person watches a storm cloud they know is coming, but cannot stop. The diner had gone quiet by then. Most of the riders had settled in for the night, worn thin from 3 days of cold from the fire, from the slow grinding pressure of watching a sheriff circle closer with each visit. Dakota sat near the window, with a mug of coffee gone cold in her hands, listening to the wind waiting for a knock that had not come yet. She had spent the evening running through possibilities in her head, the way she used to run through mission scenarios years ago, before every deployment, before every operation that mattered. Vance had backed himself into a corner. Men in corners did not act rationally. She had learned that lesson a long time ago, in places far more dangerous than a snowed-in Montana diner. And she had not let herself forget it these past 3 days, no matter how calm the surface of things had seemed. The reply from her old contact had come through earlier that evening, brief, but exactly what she needed. The land assessments were real. The shell company tied to Vance's name was real. A formal complaint was already being drafted by 2 other property owners along the route who had received similar pressure over the past year, quieter about it than she had been too afraid to push back the way she had. The information gave her ground to stand on. It did not, however, tell her what Vance might do once he realized that ground was slipping out from under him. It came at midnight. Not a knock. Headlights. 2 sets this time, sweeping fast across the snow-packed lot, moving with a kind of urgency that told her right away this was not another folder full of paperwork. She was up and moving before the first car door slammed shut outside. "Preacher," she called, low but sharp enough to cut through the quiet room. "Wake up, now." He was on his feet in seconds, old instincts firing before his eyes had even fully opened. Around the room, a handful of other riders stirred, sensing the shift in her voice, before they understood the reason for it. Dakota reached the window just as 3 men stepped out of the cars. Vance was one of them, no uniform this time, just a heavy coat and a grim tight set to his jaw. Holloway was not with him. 2 other men flanked him, instead men. Dakota did not recognize men who moved with the practiced ease of hired muscle, the kind Holloway's development company was known to keep on retainer whenever a land deal ran into trouble that paperwork alone could not fix. Her stomach dropped when she realized who was missing from the diner. Earl. He had stepped outside almost an hour earlier to check on the generator, shed the temporary one they had rigged after the fire, and he had not come back in. Dakota had assumed he was taking his time, moving slow the way he always did in the cold. She had not thought to worry. She should have. "Where's Earl?" she said, voice tight, already moving toward the door. Preacher caught her arm. "Wait. Look." Through the frosted glass she saw it. Earl, hands bound in front of him, one of the strange men gripping his arm hard enough to make the old man wince. Beside him, Rebecca, pale-faced, held just as tight by the second man. Vance stood between them, a folder tucked under one arm. The same kind of folder he had carried 3 days before, except this time his face carried none of the careful practiced politeness from before. Dakota's hand went instinctively to the door. "Dakota," Preacher said quietly, urgently. "Think before you move." He's got 2 hostages standing right there. Whatever we do next, it has to be smarter than running out that door angry. She forced herself to stop, forced the old training to override the fear clawing up her chest. Assess. Breathe. Do not give the enemy the reaction he wants. She opened the door slow instead, stepping out onto the porch alone, Han's visible voice steady despite everything screaming inside her. "Roy," she said, "let them go." Vance looked up at her, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something raw beneath the calculation in his eyes. Desperation plain and unguarded. "I warned you," he said. 72 hours, you didn't sign. "You threatened an old man and a young woman to make a point," Dakota said. "That's not enforcement, Roy. That's a crime." "It's leverage," Vance said, though his voice cracked slightly on the word, like even he did not fully believe it anymore. "You sign the papers tonight, hand them over, and everybody walks away from this. Simple as that." His eyes cut toward Rebecca. "Your friend here's been talking to people she shouldn't have. Holloway heard about it from someone at the records office this afternoon. Copies of old files, apparently. That changes things for me. Can't have loose ends walking around once this deal closes." "Nothing about this is simple," Dakota said. "Not anymore." Earl, despite the rope biting into his wrists, lifted his head and looked at Vance directly. "Roy," he said, voice steady, despite his age, despite the cold, despite the fear any reasonable man would feel in his position. "Look at me, son." Vance's jaw tightened. "Don't." "I pulled you out of that creek 40 years ago," Earl said. "Wrapped you in my own coat. Carried you home myself so your daddy wouldn't have to see you scared. You remember that? That was a long time ago." "Wasn't so long that you've forgotten it," Earl said. "I can see it in your face right now. Same scared boy underneath all that coat and badge. Difference is back then somebody showed up to pull you out of the trouble you'd wandered into. Question now is whether anybody's going to show up for you this time, or whether you've wandered too far out onto the ice all on your own." For a long moment, Vance said nothing. His grip on the folder tightened, knuckles white even in the dim porch light. "Sign the papers," he said finally, voice rougher now. "Tonight, or I can't promise what happens to them." Dakota felt something cold and clear settle into her chest, the same feeling she used to get right before the most dangerous part of a mission, when fear stopped mattering, because there was only the next right action left to take. "No," she said. Vance blinked clearly, not expecting that answer. "No, no," Dakota repeated. "I'm not signing anything under threat. Not tonight. Not ever. You want this land, Roy? You're going to have to explain to a judge exactly how you got it, and exactly what you did to 2 innocent people to try and take it." "You think I care about a judge right now?" Vance's voice rose, cracking further, the mask finally slipping all the way off. "This is the only chance I've got left. Holloway's already covering his own tracks. The deal falls apart if you don't sign tonight." "Then let it fall apart," Dakota said. "Better that than what you're standing here doing right now." One of the men holding Rebecca shifted his grip, and she let out a small, sharp gasp of pain. Dakota's whole body tensed, every old instinct screaming to close the distance to act. To end this the way she had been trained to end threats like this a lifetime ago. She held herself still instead. Barely. "Let her go," Dakota said, voice low and dangerous now. "This is between you and me, Roy. Leave them out of it." "Can't do that," Vance said. "Not anymore." Behind Dakota, the diner door creaked open just slightly. Preacher's voice came low through the gap, meant only for her. "Stall him," he whispered. "Just a little longer." Dakota did not know exactly what Preacher meant by that, but she trusted the steadiness in his voice enough to buy the time he was asking for. "Roy," she said, stepping down off the porch, slowly, hands still open at her sides. "Think about what you're doing right now. Not the money, not the deadline. Think about what your father would say, watching you hold an old man and a young woman hostage over a piece of land." "That's Mati Bosan," Don't, Vance said again, quieter this time, almost pleading. He built that hardware store with his own 2 hands, Dakota said. Never once took something that wasn't his. You told me that yourself 3 days ago before all of this started. What happened to that man's son, standing in front of me right now? Vance's hand trembled slightly around the folder. For just a moment, just a flicker, Dakota saw the boy Earl had described. Scared, desperate, in over his head, with no one left to pull him back to shore. Then his jaw hardened again, and the moment passed. Enough talking, he said. Get the paper. Sign it. Now. Inside the diner, unseen by anyone outside, Preacher had already moved to the old CB radio setup in the back office, the same one Dakota had used days before to send her quiet inquiry out into the storm. His hands moved fast and sure over the dials, tuning to a frequency he had not used in years, one reserved only for the direst kind of need. He keyed the mic voice low but urgent. This is Iron Vow calling Mayday. Repeat, this is Iron Vow calling Mayday. 56 riders under threat, Hawk Ridge, Montana, Route 9. Hostages taken. Need every brother who can hear this to spread the word. Mayday. Mayday. He released the key and waited, static crackling back at him through the storm, the silence stretching long enough to make his chest tighten with doubt. Then faint through the static, a voice answered. Then another. Then a third further away, relaying the message onward, before he had even finished repeating it a second time. Word, once it started moving through that network, moved fast. Faster than any storm, faster than any county paperwork, faster than a single sheriff standing alone in the snow could ever hope to outrun. And it moved fastest to the riders closest by. 3 chapters were already holed up at a truck stop not 40 miles west, waiting out the same weather system close enough that the ride would cost them an hour, not a day. Others farther out would take most of the night to arrive, riding only once the storm had eased enough on their side of the range to make the roads passable at all. The mountain pass east of Hawk Ridge stayed buried and closed for another 2 days yet. It was the open stretch of highway running west and the old logging route that bypassed the damaged bridge entirely that would carry every one of them in. Preacher set the mic down, breathing out slow, and returned to the front of the diner where Dakota still stood facing Vance in the freezing dark. Give me a pen, Dakota said, finally, her voice carrying a note of resignation that made Vance visibly relax just slightly. Smart choice, he said. Let Earl and Rebecca go first, Dakota said. Then I'll sign. Vance hesitated, glancing at his 2 men, some silent calculation passing behind his eyes. Finally he nodded, and the men loosened their grip, though they did not release their hostages fully. Dakota stepped close enough now to see the exhaustion etched deep into Vance's face. The toll 3 days of desperation had taken on a man who had clearly never expected things to spiral this far out of his control. You don't have to do this, she said quietly, just for him to hear. There's still a way back from this, Roy. Not an easy one, but a way back. For just a moment, something in his eyes wavered again. Then headlights swept across the lot sooner than anyone expected. Not 2 sets this time. Dozens. Vance turned startled as the first wave of motorcycles rolled into view through the falling snow engines, roaring low and steady headlights, cutting bright cones through the dark. All of them arriving from the open western stretch of Route 9. That first wave alone was enough to stop him cold. But it was only the first. Over the next several hours, as the night wore toward dawn, more kept arriving, wave after wave, rolling in from the logging route and the western highway, both filling the lot, filling the road, filling every visible inch of space around the diner, until the sound of engines drowned out even the wind. Dakota watched Vance's face drain of what little color the cold had left in it. What is this? He said, voice barely audible over the growing roar. Preacher stepped down off the porch to stand beside Dakota. Arms crossed, a grim satisfaction settling over his face. This, he said, is what happens when you threaten one of ours, Sheriff. Word travels faster than you'd believe. The riders kept coming, wave after wave, patches from a dozen different clubs visible under the harsh glow of headlights. Some wore the colors of clubs Dakota recognized from news stories over the years. Others she had never seen before, entire chapters that had ridden through the tail end of the storm, through roads only barely cleared enough to manage just to answer a single call for help. Some carried tow chains and toolkits ready for whatever mechanical trouble the stranded 56 might still be facing. Others carried simple thermoses of coffee passed hand to hand through the crowd without a word needed to explain why. An older woman with a weathered leather vest and steel gray hair pulled back tight stepped forward from near the front of the crowd. "Preacher," she called out, "we got your call." Every chapter within reach rode through what was left of the night. Word still spreading east. More coming. "Appreciate it, Iris," Preacher said. "Didn't expect this many this fast." "When a brotherhood calls Mayday," Iris said, "you don't stop to count how many. You just ride." She looked past him toward Dakota, studying her a moment, with the careful assessing eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime reading people quickly and accurately. "You're the one who took them in," Iris said. It was not quite a question. "I am," Dakota said. "Heard the whole story over the radio piece by piece as word traveled," Iris said. 56 strangers frozen half to death, and you didn't hesitate once. Takes a certain kind of person to do that, especially these days." She extended a hand and Dakota shook it, the grip firm and sure. "Name's Iris Calloway. Ridden with these clubs going on 30 years now. Don't often get to see the kind of decency your name's already carrying up and down this network tonight." "I just opened a door," Dakota said. "Wasn't anything more complicated than that." "Never is," Iris said, "and it's exactly why so few people manage to do it when it actually matters." Vance stood frozen in the middle of the lot, his 2 hired men already backing away, slowly, clearly recalculating whatever plan they thought they had walked into tonight. The folders slipped from Vance's grip papers, scattering loose across the snow, and he made no move to gather them. Dakota stepped forward and took Rebecca gently by the arm, guiding her away from the man who had been holding her, checking quickly for any real injury, beyond the fear still plain in her eyes. "You're safe now," she said. "It's over." Rebecca nodded, shaking tears finally breaking free now that the danger had passed. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." Dakota checked her wrists, first gently turning them over to look for any lasting damage from the grip that had held her, then checked her breathing, her pulse, the old routine coming back automatic, even after all these years away from that kind of work. "You're going to be sore for a few days," Dakota said. "Nothing broken near as I can tell. Sit down a minute. Let your body catch up with what your mind already knows. It's over." Rebecca sank onto the porch step, still trembling, and Dale Ferris appeared beside her, almost instantly with a blanket pulled from somewhere wrapping it around her shoulders, without a word needing to pass between them. "I kept thinking about my mother," Rebecca said quietly once her breathing had steadied some. "About how nobody ever showed up for her when she needed it. Kept thinking, is this how it ends? Some man deciding my life is worth less than a piece of land." "It's not how it ended," Dale said gently. "Not tonight, not ever long as any of us have a say in it." Earl, meanwhile, sat nearby, rubbing feeling back into his wrists. Preacher crouched beside him, checking his pulse and the color in his face, with the same careful attention Dakota had shown Rebecca. "You holding up all right, old-timer?" Preacher asked. "Been colder," Earl said, managing a tired but genuine smile. "Been more scared too, if I'm honest. But I'll tell you, watching all these headlights come rolling in just now, that's about the finest sight these old eyes have seen in a good long while." Preacher chuckled softly, relief plain in the sound of it. Wasn't sure the call would reach far enough in time. Storm's still causing trouble on half the roads out here. "Reached exactly far enough," Earl said. "Reckon that's usually how these things work out one way or another, so long as somebody's willing to make the call in the first place." And Preacher moved to untie Earl's wrists himself, careful and gentle, despite the urgency of the moment. The old man rubbed at the rope marks, wincing slightly, but his eyes stayed fixed on Vance the whole time. "Roy," Earl said, voice carrying clear across the sudden quiet that had fallen over the crowd. "Look at what you've done here tonight. Look at all these people who showed up not because they were paid to, not because a badge told them to, but because one of their own needed help. That's the kind of loyalty your daddy tried to teach you your whole life. Just took you a strange direction to finally see it in action. Vance said nothing, staring out at the sea of riders surrounding him, at the sheer scale of what his desperation had summoned into being. Somewhere behind the crowd, more headlights approached, steadier and more official this time. A county sheriff's cruiser from the next district over, followed by a state trooper vehicle, both responding to reports that had already started filtering through official channels. Once enough witnesses along the highway had spotted the massive gathering of riders and called it in themselves. The state trooper, who stepped out, a broad-shouldered man named Franklin, took one look at the scene, the scattered documents in the snow, Vance, standing frozen and unarmed in the middle of it all, and immediately radioed for backup. "Sheriff Vance," Franklin said, approaching slowly, hand resting near his sidearm out of habit more than immediate concern. "We've received multiple calls about a hostage situation at this location. I'm going to need you to step away from these two individuals and explain exactly what's going on here." Vance looked around one more time at Earl, at Rebecca, at the hundreds of riders watching him in absolute silence, at Dakota standing steady in the middle of it all. And something in him finally seemed to break, not violently, but quietly, like a man setting down a weight he could no longer carry. "I made a mistake," he said, voice hollow. "A big one." "You're going to need to come with me," Franklin said, "and we're going to sort out exactly how big down at the station." Vance nodded slowly, offering no resistance as Franklin guided him toward the waiting cruiser. Before he ducked inside, he glanced back once at Earl, standing free now beside Dakota, rubbing at his wrists in the cold morning air. "I'm sorry," Vance said, "for all of it." Earl studied him a long moment before answering. "I know you are, son. Question now is what you do with that sorry." "Same question I had to answer myself a long time ago." Vance said nothing more, ducking into the cruiser as Franklin closed the door behind him. Dawn had begun to break by then, the sky shifting slow from black to deep gray. Then finally to the pale gold of a sun trying its best to push through the last of the storm clouds. The snow had finally started to ease, flurries thinning into scattered flakes, drifting lazy through air that felt for the first time in 3 days almost calm. Dakota stood in the middle of her parking lot, surrounded by more motorcycles than she had ever seen gathered in one place in her entire life, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for longer than just the last 3 days, longer than the storm, longer maybe than she wanted to admit. Preacher came to stand beside her, watching the sunrise break slow over the mountains in the distance. 1,500, he said, give or take. That's what Iris counted before the last of them settled in. 1,500 people, Dakota said, shaking her head slowly. Rode through the tail of a blizzard for 56 strangers. Wasn't for the 56, Preacher said. Was for the call, for the code. Something you understand better than most, given what you used to do for a living. Dakota thought about that, about the years she had spent trusting her life to people she had never met before a mission, trusting a code that ran deeper than any single relationship. She had left that world behind, believing she would never find anything like it again outside the service. Standing here now watching hundreds of riders slowly begin clearing snow from the lot without being asked, checking on each other's bikes, sharing coffee, that had somehow already appeared from somewhere, she understood she had been wrong about that. By mid-morning, the county's road crew had finally managed to push through the last of the blocked western stretch, escorted by state troopers, eager to restore normal traffic to Route 9. News of the overnight gathering had already begun spreading through the county, then the state picked up first by local radio, then by a regional news station that sent a small crew out to capture footage of the aftermath. A young reporter bundled tight against the cold found Dakota near the diner's front steps and asked somewhat breathlessly if she would be willing to answer a few questions about what had happened. Dakota considered it a moment before nodding. Some stories deserve to be told honestly, not buried under rumor and assumption, the way this town had almost let happen from the very first night. 3 nights ago, she said, the reporter's microphone hovering close. 56 people got caught in a storm and needed somewhere warm. I had room. That's the whole story, really. Everything else that happened afterward, that was other people trying to make it into something it never was. Some residents have expressed concern, the reporter said carefully, about large groups like this passing through smaller communities. What would you say to that? Dakota glanced back at the lot at riders helping an elderly local resident dig her car out from beneath a snowbank without being asked, at another group quietly repairing a fence that had come loose along the property line during the storm work. Nobody had requested, but everyone seemed glad to see done anyway. I'd say judge people by what they actually do, Dakota said, not by what they happen to be wearing when they do it. These folks showed up when I needed help, stayed calm through threats and fire and worse. And this morning they're out there fixing fences that aren't even theirs. Seems to me that says more about who they are than any patch on a jacket ever could. There are reports, the reporter continued, that the local sheriff was involved in some kind of scheme tied to the highway expansion project. Can you speak to that at all? That's a matter for the courts now, Dakota said carefully. What I can tell you is that a young woman standing right over there had the courage to come forward with information she'd been sitting on for a long while, out of fear more than anything else. Took a night like last night for her to finally feel safe enough to speak up. That's a story worth telling too, maybe more than mine. The reporter glanced toward Rebecca, still wrapped in her blanket near the porch steps, and made a note to follow up with her directly once she had recovered enough to speak on camera herself. One last question, the reporter said. What do you want people watching this tonight to take away from what happened here? Dakota considered that for a long moment, the morning sun finally breaking fully over the mountains, behind her casting long gold light across a lot, still crowded with hundreds of motorcycles. That kindness isn't complicated, she said finally. Somebody needed shelter, I had a roof. That's all it ever takes to start something good. Everything else that happened after good and bad, that just proves the point further. Show up for people when they need it, and you'll be amazed how many show up for you in return when your turn comes around. The reporter thanked her and moved on to interview a few of the riders themselves, capturing footage that would run on the evening news that night. Footage that would eventually make its way further than any of them expected, carried by a public hungry for a story about decency showing up when it mattered most. By afternoon, the crowd had begun to thin, riders slowly departing in small groups now that the road was finally clear, each one stopping first to shake Dakota's hand or Earl's, offering quiet thanks for a shelter that had turned into something far more significant than any of them had expected 3 nights ago. Rebecca lingered longer than most, helping Dakota clean the diner's kitchen alongside Dale Ferris, the 3 of them working in comfortable, easy quiet that felt earned rather than forced. What happens now? Dakota asked her, with everything you know about Vance's dealings. The land assessments, all of it. I've already spoken with the state trooper, Rebecca said. Turns out my old copies matter a great deal more now than I ever expected them to. County's opening a formal investigation. Might take months to sort all the way through, but it's moving. You did something important, Dakota said, speaking up like that. Took me long enough, Rebecca said, a small, tired smile crossing her face. Guess sometimes it takes almost losing something to finally find the courage to protect it. Earl, sitting nearby with a fresh mug of coffee, chuckled softly at that. That's about as true a thing as I've heard all week, young lady. Courage rarely shows up early. Mostly it shows up exactly when it's needed, not a moment before. By early evening, the last of the visiting riders had departed, the lot finally empty, except for the original 56 bikes now cleared of snow and running again, engines warmed and ready for the road ahead. Preacher found Dakota alone behind the counter as the sun began its slow descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and violet that felt like a gift after 3 days of endless gray. We'll be heading out at first light tomorrow, he said. Storm's cleared. No reason to keep imposing on your hospitality any longer than we already have. You were never an imposition, Dakota said. Not for 1 minute. Most folks would disagree. Preacher said, a faint smile crossing his face. 56 strangers, 3 days of fire, a hostage situation. That's a lot to hand a person who just wanted to run a quiet diner. Maybe, Dakota said. But I got something out of it too. More than I expected to. What's that? She thought about it a long moment, watching the sunset deepen over the mountains, feeling the weight of the last 5 years settle into something lighter than it had been in a long while. Reminder, she said finally, that the world still got more good in it than I'd let myself believe lately. Reminder that showing up for people, even strangers, even when it's inconvenient or risky, still matters. Guess I'd forgotten that somewhere along the way, running this place quiet and alone. Preacher nodded, understanding, passing unspoken between them. Michael would be proud, he said quietly, seeing the woman you've become since. Proud of the choice you made 3 nights ago and every choice since. Dakota felt her throat tighten slightly at that. But the feeling underneath it was warm rather than painful. The grief finally settling into something closer to peace than it had managed in years. Thank you, she said, for bringing him back to me, even just a small piece of him. Didn't know how much I needed that until you handed it over. Storms have a way of bringing exactly what's needed, Preacher said, even when we don't know we're waiting for it. That evening, the diner hosted one final meal together, quieter now, with just the original 56 Earl and Dakota gathered around tables pushed together into one long shared surface. Nobody rushed through the food. Nobody hurried the conversation. 3 days of shared hardship had built something worth savoring before the road pulled them all back into separate directions come morning. Earl stood near the end of the meal, tapping his mug gently for attention one final time. Been a long few days, he said, voice carrying warm and steady across the room. Started with a storm nobody asked for, and a decision one woman made in about 30 seconds that changed the course of things more than any of us could have guessed. I've lived a long while in this county, seen a lot of hard winters, buried a lot of good friends. But I don't know that I've seen anything quite like what happened here this week. He raised his mug slightly. To showing up, he said, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. That's the only kind of showing up that ever really counts for anything. Mugs rose around the room, 56 riders, and one old man, and one steady woman behind the counter, all lifting whatever they were drinking in quiet agreement. The moment settling into something that felt less like an ending and more like the start of something that would carry forward long after the roads dried and everyone scattered back to their separate lives. The next morning came clear and cold, the sky a hard, bright blue that felt almost unfamiliar after 3 days of endless gray. The riders gathered their gear, checked their bikes one final time, and slowly began the process of departing, engines rumbling to life one by one across the lot. Preacher was the last to leave, pausing beside his bike to shake Dakota's hand one final time. You ever need anything, he said. Anything at all, you reach out on that radio. Won't matter how far away we are. Somebody will answer. I believe that now, Dakota said. Didn't 3 days ago. Do now. Storms have a way of teaching us things, Preacher said, swinging a leg over his bike, that calm weather never could. He rode off down Route 9 with the rest of the club trailing behind him. The sound of 56 engines fading slowly into the crisp morning air until only silence remained and the quiet, steady hum of Dakota's diner sign flickering back on for another ordinary day. Word of what had happened in Hawk Ridge did not fade quickly, though. Over the following months, the story continued to spread, carried by news segments, then by word of mouth among riders across a dozen states, then finally settling into something like local legend. The diner that had sheltered 56 strangers through a killer storm, only to have 1,500 more arrive at dawn to stand against injustice, became a story told and retold at rest stops and rallies far beyond the borders of Montana. Riders began stopping through Hawk Ridge deliberately after that. Sometimes just for a meal, sometimes simply to see the place where the story had happened. Dakota never charged extra, never made a show of it, just kept doing what she had always done. Feeding people, giving shelter when it was needed, treating every stranger who walked through her door with the same steady decency regardless of what they wore or rode. Roy Vance's case moved slowly through the courts over the following year. The land assessment documents Rebecca had preserved, playing a central role in the county's investigation into a wider pattern of corruption tied to the highway expansion project. He faced multiple felony charges, in the end kidnapping and extortion chief among them, along with the corruption tied to the land scheme itself. His full cooperation with investigators testifying against the shell company and the men who had carried out his orders earned him a reduced sentence, rather than the maximum the charges could have carried. Though it was still a real one, still years of his life he would spend paying for what he had nearly done. Earl visited him once during the early months of his sentence, an act that surprised nearly everyone in town who heard about it. Man made a terrible mistake, Earl told Dakota afterward. One that could have cost people their safety, maybe their lives. But I made a promise to his daddy once, a long time ago, that I'd look out for that boy best I could. Didn't figure that promise had an expiration date on it just because he grew up and made some poor choices. How'd he seem? Dakota asked. Tired, Earl said. Tired in the way a man gets when he's finally stopped running from himself. Reckon that's about the best a person can hope for starting out on the long road back. You think he'll change? Dakota asked. Really change, not just talk about it. Earl considered that a long while, turning his coffee mug slow in his weathered hands. Change is a strange thing, he said finally. Comes slow most of the time, one honest choice stacked on top of another. Until one day a man looks up and realizes he's become somebody different than the person who walked into that cell. Whether Roy manages it or not, I couldn't tell you for certain. But I told him the offer stands, same as it always has. Man wants help finding his way back, my door's open. Same as yours was that first night of the storm. Guess that's the lesson underneath all of it, Dakota said. Doors staying open even when the person on the other side hasn't earned it yet. Especially then, Earl said. Earned kindness isn't worth near as much as the kind handed out before anybody's proven they deserve it. That's the only kind that ever really changes a person in my experience. You think Roy will come find you once he's out? Wouldn't surprise me, Earl said. And if he does, my door'll be open same as it always was. Man doesn't get to decide who deserves a second chance just because he's the one who needs it. That's not how any of this is supposed to work, far as I've ever seen. Rebecca stayed in touch as well, sending word occasionally from wherever the club's travels took her, always closing her messages the same simple way. Still writing, still grateful, still remembering Hawk Ridge. Dakota kept the small wooden bird Preacher had given her on a shelf behind the counter where she could see it every day while she worked. A quiet reminder of a debt finally paid. A circle finally closed, a piece of her old life folded gently into the new one she had built here. Beside it in time, she added a second photograph to the one already tucked behind the register, her daughter a little older now, visiting for a whole summer once the diner's schedule finally settled enough to allow it. Some nights, when the diner emptied out and the last of the evening light faded over the mountains, she would think back on that first night of the storm, on the decision she had made in less than 30 seconds, without a single moment of doubt. 56 strangers frozen and desperate, needing nothing more than an open door and a warm room to survive the night. She had given them that, without hesitation, the same way any decent person would, or so she had told herself at the time. She understood now, it had been more than that. It had been the first step in remembering who she used to be, before grief had convinced her that showing up for people always came with too high a cost. It had been the first step toward letting a new kind of family find her, one built not from blood, but from the simple, steady choice to do right by strangers when it mattered most. The seasons turned. Winter gave way to spring to summer, the diner's business steadier now than it had ever been, word of mouth carrying travelers from further afield with each passing month. Earl still stopped by most mornings for coffee, still offered his quiet wisdom whenever the moment called for it, still reminded Dakota in his own patient way that the world held more decency in it than the news often let on. One evening, nearly a year after the storm, Dakota sat on the porch steps, watching the sun set the same way she had that very first night before any of it had happened. Earl joined her, easing himself down slow beside her, 2 mugs of coffee steaming between them. Hard to believe it's been a year, she said. Time moves strange like that, Earl said. Feels like yesterday and forever ago, all at once, depending on which memory you land on first. Preacher sent word last week, Dakota said. Says the club's planning a ride back through here, come autumn. Whole chapter, maybe a few others besides. Wouldn't surprise me a bit, Earl said. Reckon this place means something different to them now than it did that first night. Started out as just shelter from a storm, turned into something a lot of folks needed reminding still existed in this world. What's that? Proof, Earl said, that decency still shows up when it matters without needing to be asked twice. That's a rare enough thing these days. People tend to want to hold on to it once they've found it. Dakota looked out at the darkening road, quiet now, empty except for the last of the daylight fading behind the mountains. You ever think about what would have happened, she asked, if I hadn't opened that door? If I'd listened to the part of me that just wanted to stay safe, stay quiet, keep my head down, like I had the 2 years before that. Don't spend much time on what-ifs, Earl said. Never did see the use in it. What matters is what you did. Do not what you might have done otherwise. And what you did was open a door when 56 people needed it opened. Rest of it, good and hard as it turned out to be, that's just the world responding in kind. Dakota smiled, small and tired and genuine, watching the last light fade fully from the sky. Every so often after that, usually without warning, the low rumble of motorcycle engines would echo down Route 9, once more riders passing through on their way to somewhere else, always stopping for at least one meal at the diner, that had become something like a landmark among their kind. Dakota welcomed each of them the same way she had welcomed the first 56, without hesitation, without judgment, with nothing more than an open door and a warm plate of food waiting. Because that she had come to understand was the only lesson worth carrying forward from a storm nobody had asked for. The measure of a life was never found in the years spent guarding against hardship or keeping the world at arm's length for safety's sake. It was found in the moments a person chose freely and without hesitation to open the door anyway. The storm had passed long ago, but the warmth it left behind, the strange and steady family it had built out of 56 frozen strangers and one determined woman who refused to look away, that remained long after the snow had melted, long after the last engine had faded down, the empty road carried forward one open door at a time.